Robertson here with LO Counseling and Wellness, holistic addiction and trauma therapist, here sharing this Recovery Month series, which I've done for a while. Usually try and get a few colleagues, friends, people that I really respect in long-term recovery that are willing to share their story for just to have that experience, strength, and hope, and to see that there is the possibility for long-term recovery. Because a lot of us don't see that, right? If you go to meetings or don't go to meetings or do any of those things, you don't get to see a lot of those stories. So I'm super, super grateful to Gio for being willing to come here and share his story. And as we talked about, this is your story, so you get to share as much or as little as you'd like. If it gets to it, as I said, I might ask some questions here and there, but this is really just for you to get an opportunity to share anything that you feel would be poignant for people who might still be struggling or who are newly sober or somewhere along their journey. It could really use to hear that they're not alone and what other people have experienced as well. So with that, and again, you can share as much or as little you want to about what you're doing in the world and all of those things too, and we'll go from there. So with that, Gio, thank you so much for being here.
Of course. Thank you for asking me. Hello, everybody. My name is Gio, and I'm a recovered drug addict and alcoholic. My sobriety date is January 20th of 2015, which means I have a little over 10 and a half years right now. And at one point I couldn't put 24 hours of sobriety together. Maybe if there were some consequences in play, family or girlfriend or the judicial system, maybe I could put a little bit of time together. But at the very end of my addiction, I couldn't even put 24 hours of sobriety together. I'm going to kind of go through my story. Lori, you mentioned you're a trauma therapist and you're very into the holistic side of healing. So I'm going to touch on some things that I do and I don't, depending on where I am and when I tell my story. But I grew up in a very big family. I was born in New Jersey. My dad was one of 6 siblings. My mom was one of 10. And in the area that we lived, our family was really well known. I had a lot of aunts and uncles. I had my grandparents on my father's side. I had my grandmother on my mother's side. I had a lot of cousins growing up. So at a very young age, I had that love and belonging. Fast forward to when I was 6, turning 7, which was the year 1989. I remember my family sitting down with me and telling me that we're moving to Port St. Lucie, Florida. And they're telling me I'm going to have this new start and I'm going to love Florida. And I remember it being very excited to move. And, when we moved during the summertime. I'd completed kindergarten and, I was very excited for a new start. And when I got to Port St. Lucie, it was different. It was a lot different than New Jersey. And, now, if anybody's familiar with Port St. Lucie, it's almost like a West Palm Beach in a sense, the way it's boomed with construction and housing and people moving here and jobs. But back then it was basically all woods. And, what I didn't know, it was a very Southern kind of racist area. And, growing up in New Jersey, I understood the difference between skin color, but I wasn't introduced to racism yet. And, so when we moved here, I was very excited to start school. And, some of my cousins and my aunts and uncles moved with us. And, I was kind of jealous because they all moved in this same cul-de-sac, which was 10 minutes down the road from us. And my parents had the house built outside of that cul-de-sac 10 minutes down the road. So every time, during the summer, I would go see them. I would start to see that they were getting closer and they had the same inside jokes. So it was probably then I started feeling like an outsider with my own family. And then they were all excited, to go to school as well. And, they found out what school they were going to. And I was hoping to go to the same school as them. And then I found out that I was going to a different school. And, as I mentioned, Port St. Lucie was a very racist town back then. And so what I didn't know is segregation was still going on in the schools. And so because of where my house was zoned, I was transferred to the next city over to Fort Pierce to go to school. And the moment I got off the bus, I was attacked for being white. And I didn't really understand what was going on. I didn't have any answers. So I remember like going to talk to my parents about it. And I mustered up the courage to go tell my dad what happened. And there was some shame there, but I walked up to my dad and I told him what was going on, and the way my dad dealt with things and like his generation of men dealt with things is he told me, he's like, hey, listen, this happens from time to time, go back to school, keep fighting these kids, and one day you'll beat one of them up and they'll finally leave you alone. And that wasn't the answer that I wanted. It just instilled more fear into me. And so I went to my mom and I told my mom what happened, and she jumped on the phone with the school board and she's arguing with the school board. And I could hear the lady talking through the phone. And she said, ma'am, she said, there's nothing we could do because of where your house is zoned. He has to go to the school. And she started talking about segregation, which I wasn't really familiar with. And she said, because of where your house is zoned, he has to go to Fort Pierce. And she said her exact words were, we ship 3 black kids to the white schools and we ship 3 white kids to the black schools. And so going back to school, having to face that, instead of blaming the school system, instead of blaming my parents, instead of blaming the kids, for some reason I went internal with it. Why is this happening to me? Why did my parents move 10 minutes from my cousins? Why can't we have moved into the same cul-de-sac? And I went to the same school with them. They would protect me. Why is all this bad stuff happening to me? And so I joke around. Sometimes I work in treatment, and I'm very involved in the local recovery community where I'm at. And I joke and I say that video games and junk food were my first addiction. What I would do is I would lock myself in my bedroom. I would eat junk food and I'd play video games. And that was my escape from the world, because if I could lock myself in my bedroom and it's just me, I know I'm safe. And I think the video games and the junk food gave me like boosts of dopamine. Um, Fast forward around the time that I was 10 years old. Um, so my parents, when we first moved here, my parents kind of like had a routine. And this was another thing that kind of put a little bit of trauma into me, is my dad would go to work during the day, and we'd usually come home from school and my mom would be getting ready to work, and she'd work either bartending or waitressing at night. So this way one of the parents was home with us. And sometimes there was like a gap where I had to babysit my sister for like maybe 30 minutes until my dad got there. Um, and so my dad, being from New Jersey and coming here working construction in this hot Florida heat, he'd come home exhausted. And as a kid, I didn't, I wasn't used to that. My dad would come home in New Jersey and he'd give me attention. And so my dad would come home and he'd be tired and he'd just want to relax and like watch TV and cool down. And as soon as he'd come home, I'd be excited to see him, and like I'd want to do something. I'd want to play ball or do something. And I started feeling neglected because I didn't really understand what was going on. And at the same time, my mom would be rushing out the door when I got home from school, and I wouldn't see her. So I started feeling neglected from my parents. I started feeling like they failed me. I started feeling like there was something wrong with me. So like I said, I'd lock myself in my room, um, and just lock myself in, and you know tune out the world with video games. But there was one night I remember that my dad had to work like extra hours, or he had to do something, and he wasn't going to be home. So my mom had asked the neighbors across the street if they could watch us until my dad got home. And there was something about the neighbors. I just didn't trust them. Like I hung out with their daughter, which was a couple years older than me, when she'd be playing in the neighborhood. But there was something about the house and like the parents I just didn't trust. And so I remember like I was outside, my sister's inside the house, and I'm outside. It's getting dark, and the parents are coming out, and they're saying, "Hey, like it's getting dark. Your dad's not going to be home for a couple hours. Just come in. You'll be safe." And I remember like being out there getting bit by mosquitoes and not wanting to go in. But needless to say, they sent the daughter out there to come get me. And the daughter talks me into coming into the house, and I go into the house, and we're in the room, and the parents aren't paying any attention to us. And you know, the daughter, she had molested me, and we didn't get caught then, but it continued for a little bit. Then we ended up getting caught one day, and it was actually at my house. My parents were having a party, and one of the moms had walked in, and she was about 3 or 4 years older than me. And one of the moms had walked in and caught what was going on and ran out. And I remember hiding, and all of the parents came in the room, and they're grabbing the kids because there was other kids in the room, and we were in the closet. And I remember the girls getting in trouble, and I remember like everybody leaving the party after that happened. And I remember my dad coming to look for me, and I knew I had did something wrong, right? Like there was shame. I couldn't face my family. But my dad was, he was intoxicated because he had been drinking. And as he's like yelling my name and telling me I'm in trouble, he whispered, he's like, "Good job, buddy." And so to me, I was very confused because I knew I was doing something wrong. There was shame there. There was guilt there. Like my mom would give me dirty looks after that. She wouldn't have a conversation. So like there was more shame. And then my dad would brag to his friends that I became a man. What I learned way later on in life is a therapist had finally called me out one day, and she told me that was sexual trauma. And I was unwilling to look at that because um, in my mind, I had became a man that day at 10 years old. Even though I was confused, even though I had questions, even though I knew she took advantage of me, um, I had just programmed it that way. So at a very young age, I was just kind of lost. I didn't know who I was. I became a people pleaser. I was very insecure. There was parts where my ego came out. I was very rebellious. Um, and and yeah, um, so going into the drug use and alcohol, um, my cousins actually let me back up. So my parents were having a New Year's Eve party at my house, and my older cousins were over, and they had talked me into stealing some beer from the adults. And by this time, I had like a couple sips of beer. I didn't really like the taste of beer. I didn't feel any effects from it. Um, but I knew that the adults would drink, and it would make them happy. So I had this bright idea of sneaking in the garage and stealing beers. And as I go into the garage, I grab all these beers and I line. It was New Year's Eve, so it's semi cold in Florida. So I have like a big sweater on, and I have jeans on, and I'm like lighting my socks, and like I had my shirt tucked in, and I have all these beers. And I grabbed three beers in my hands. And my bright idea was I'm going to walk past the adults. If they stop me, I'm going to say they're for another adult, and either they take them or they let me go with them. But either way, I'll have all these other beers hitting on me, and I'll get away with it. And as I'm crossing the threshold of the living room, my uncle, I'll never forget it. It was my uncle, my dad, and my uncle, and they're like a single file line talking. And my uncle hits my dad on the shoulder, and all three adults stop. And then my uncle points at me, and the adults turn over and they look at me, and they just start smiling and laughing. So I just went to my room with the three beers. And so once again, in that moment, I had become a man, right?
Were you still 10 at that point, or were you a little older?
I was 12. And so another thing is too, actually, it just popped in my head, and I haven't thought about this in a while. After the sexual trauma happened with the babysitter at 10 years old, I remember I stopped playing with toys. I stopped, like really doing like video games and stuff like that. And I was telling myself, I'm a teenager now, even though I'm 10 years old. Like I'm an adult, young adult now. They don't play with toys anymore. And I remember there was a part of me that was still craving to play with, certain toys. Um, but I remember like this mindset that had come over me. So, like I said, my identity, I was very confused at a young age about a lot of things in life. But so as I walk back into my bedroom at 12 years old with these beers and I'm pulling them out, like my cousins are amazed. And my cousins are 3 and 4 years older than me. So I look up to them and they were cool in school and nobody messed with them and just, they were getting all the pretty girls of their grades. So like I really looked up to them. And so in that moment when I was pulling those beers out, it was feeding my ego, right?
Mm.
Is because deep down inside, I was a scared, hurt little boy, very confused. But in that moment, people liked me for something I was doing, right? And that in itself was like almost like a drug to me. It was very intoxicating. That feeling that rushed over me. And needless to say, like I got a kick out of that. I would act out. I started fighting, vandalizing stuff. I got in trouble for vandalizing something when I was a kid. I got in trouble for egging a house when I was a kid. I got in trouble for being out after curfew. Like I can go down the list. I got in trouble a lot as a kid. And we'll fast forward. You know, well, actually, I'll go back to 12. So I remember drinking those beers with my cousin. I don't remember getting drunk. Like I'm very involved in Alcoholics Anonymous, and I've heard people talk about that first drink. I don't remember like the feeling like buzzed, or I don't remember like the feeling of it. I just remember drinking it to be cool, to feel accepted. I had like one or two beers. Um, but what I do know is my older cousins snuck outside to smoke weed, and they asked me if I wanted to hit it, and I told them no because that my mindset then was drugs are bad. I don't want to go down that path. And so fast forward to 14 years old, um, get into a car accident. It's me, my mom, and my friend. We get into a car accident. We get banged up a little bit, but we end up going to a doctor. Doctor starts prescribing me opiates, and I didn't take the opiates at first. But what I did know is I did know like my mom's friend would come over after work, and my mom would like break a half a pill, and they would take a half a opiate, and they would drink some wine. And I remember they'd sit around laughing and talking, and like they'd be all happy. And so I knew alcohol enhanced the effects of those pills that they were taking, but at that time I didn't know what those effects were. And so I remember my mom's friend, she came and she knocked on my bedroom door one day, and she tells me, she's like, hey, your mom just ran to the bathroom. She's like, is there any way that you can give me a couple pills? Your mom told me to come ask you. And I'm like, yeah, sure. I'm not thinking anything. It's an adult. I trust her. But when I open up my dresser drawer, because I had been going to the doctors for months and not taking these pills, I literally had a whole dresser drawer filled with opiates. And when she sees the prescription bottles, her eyes light up real big. And I ask her what kind. She tells me what kind. I grab the bottle and I walk over and I ask her how many. She tells me, and I give her a couple of them. And she immediately turns around. She says, thank you. She turns around to walk away. As I'm shutting the door, I could see past her. I could see my mom's bedroom door still shut. Um, so I knew that my mom was in the bathroom. And she immediately turns around and like almost pushes the door open on me. And she's like, hey, can I get some more? And I'm like, yeah, how many? And she's like, I'll tell you when to stop. So I open up the bottle, and as I'm pouring almost this whole bottle of opiates in her hand, um, she's like, there's like this excitement that's coming off of her. And she says, thank you. And she immediately turns around to walk away. I could still see my mom's bedroom door shut. And she turns around again and she looks at me and she goes, don't tell your mom. And as I'm shutting the door, I just realized she manipulated me for these pills. But I'm like, what is it about these pills? Why did she take the chance of running over while my mom's in the bathroom, manipulating me, knowing I might tell on her, but asking me for these pills and getting very excited? And because I had watched them, my mom and her would drink some, like a glass of wine and take a half a pill. I knew the alcohol enhanced effects. So my first time ever taking opiates, I went to the garage, I stole a couple beers, but I drank three Budweisers and I took three Vicodin extra strength pills. And I'll never forget that feeling. When that feeling hit me, all of that fear, all of that insecurity, all of that worry, all that self doubt, all of that all that stress that comes with putting on the different masks, to be different people, to people please. Just everything was gone, and I finally felt like I could breathe in my own skin. I felt comfortable, and I remember like this feeling. I was like, I want to feel like this for the rest of my life. Like this is it. Um, and I chased that for 18 years. I chased that feeling. Um, just for time's sake, because I could get into my story. Sometimes I could speak for over an hour, but just for time's sake, I'm going to kind of go through the progression real quick. So 14, I start taking those pills daily, because I had the whole dresser drawer filled with them and I wasn't taking them. Plus, still going to the doctor. I had a big supply to take daily. Um, I started drinking daily. Someone had talked me into selling some of the pills. So I had sold a couple of the pills to my friend, which ended up in exchange kind of getting me into like the marijuana scene. Started smoking weed every day, started selling weed every day. Um, and I look back because I have two kids that are older than 14. But like I look back and I think of like when they were 14, how innocent they were. And I'm like, man, like I was wild. Like it's really hard for me to fathom now, but like in that moment, everything had just grabbed a hold of me, you know? And so the progression gets worse when I turn 15, it turns into harder substances. The progression gets worse when I turn 16, it turns into harder substances. And I still thought it was a party. Even though I'm using every day, I'm using large amounts of different drugs every day and alcohol. It just I felt like I had control and I could stop it whenever I wanted to. Looking back now, knowing what I know about the disease of addiction, I had the disease of addiction from the very beginning. And it might have been even been in me, and like there was traces of it with the video games and junk food. You know, um, So around the time that I was 17, about to turn 18, my oldest son's mother, I come home from work one day and she has a pregnancy test. And she says, listen, she goes, I'm pregnant. This is your kid, of course. She goes, but there's an ultimatum. She's like, if you want to be with me and you want to have this kid with me, you have to stop doing drugs. She goes, you have to stop selling drugs. She's like, I grew up with my dad in that lifestyle and I can't be with somebody that's in that lifestyle. And I watched what it did to me and my sister, and I don't want that for my kids. So I planned on marrying this girl, it was high school sweetheart. I was in love with her. I wanted this family. I wanted to raise my kid. I was turning 18. I already had a job. So in that moment I could pass a lie detector test, and I meant it, and I was like, deal. I immediately stopped. I stopped selling drugs. I stopped doing hard drugs. So she had like a rule. She's like, I don't care if you come home from work and have like a couple beers to like relax, and she's like, I don't care if like you smoke a little bit of weed, but she's like, it can't be nowhere near like what you're doing. And so like in a 12-step program, for step one, there's two parts of step one. We admitted that our lives had become powerless, and then there's a space, and that our lives had become unmanageable. Well, I didn't fully understand what that unmanageability meant in the 12-step program, and my sponsor broke it down really good for me. And the unmanageability kicked in the moment that someone was controlling my drug use and my alcoholism and limiting me. When you take drugs and alcohol away from an addict or alcoholic, they don't automatically get better if they have the disease of addiction. I didn't know what cravings were. I was, and the Alcoholics Anonymous book says it really well. We become restless, irritable, and discontent unless at once we can experience that sense of ease and comfort, which comes from the first drink. And that's exactly what was going on with me. Is like I was miserable, and my son was born, and he was like 3 months old. I come home from work one day, and all of her stuff's packed. All of his stuff's packed. And she's like, "Hey, listen, my mom's on her way to come get me. I'm moving in with my mom." She's like, "You're not the person I fell in love with. You're absolutely miserable, and I don't want to be with you no more." And you would think in that moment, like I'd be heartbroken. Like the love of my life is leaving me. She's taking my kid. Another man's eventually going to be in the picture. And no, like the moment she left, it was like right back off to the races. I made a phone call. I called my cousin. I went to my cousin's house, and I started using and selling drugs again. And this time the drugs had progressed. And this was in the late '90s, or I'm sorry, the early 2000s. Um, and Oxy 80s. The Oxycontin 80 milligrams were the big thing then. And so I went from using Vicodins to Oxycontin 80 milligrams. And by then, the doctors in South Florida, we had all the pain mills and crooked doctors and so forth. And so for me, getting into that scene, everybody was doing them in Port St. Lucie. People that I went to school with, their parents were using them. Friends' parents were using them. Like everybody were going to these doctors, so in my mind, it was easy to justify and hide my addiction because I had back problems from my car accident and I'm going to doctors again. And everybody, if we're all doing this and we're going to doctors and we're getting these pills, it can't be an addiction. If my friends' parents have a beautiful house and a beautiful jobs and they have beautiful cars on the driveway and they're a loving family, and if they're going to these same doctors and they're using the pills just like I do, it can't be an addiction. And let's just say my opiate use got bad. Things got really bad very quickly. I had a job. I always maintained a job, and but to me, selling drugs was more of like a supply and demand thing to feed my ego. Right, like I can get drugs from my older cousins and the older group that they hung out with that my age group couldn't get. And so to me, like I had something you needed and you had something I needed. And I needed to feel accepted. I needed to feel cool in your eyes. And so to me, like selling drugs then at that point, it was just supply and demand to feed my ego. And but needless to say, I sold to somebody and they I sold to them at my parents' house where I was staying, and they had brung a undercover Port St. Lucie police officer with them, and it was someone I thought I trusted. But needless to say, I ended up getting my parents' house raided and getting in trouble with the law and fighting that for a while. And the first time I got sentenced to go to prison was 16 months in prison, followed by 4 years, or I'm sorry, 3 years of probation. And like while I was in the county jail, waiting to go to prison, everybody was telling me like, "Hey, you're a youthful offender. You're under the age of 24. The judge sentenced you to a youthful offender prison. So this is where you're going, and you need to be prepared because it's gladiator school." And they told me like, everything to expect, and all the horror stories were true. you know, when you get to that prison, the moment you get off the bus, they have this thing called Friday Night Fight Night, which is like initiation. And I didn't think I was going to be the first one because I was the biggest one out of all 50 inmates that got transported to this prison. But no, I was the first one. I had to go fight. I ended up fighting three people back to back. I got pretty banged up, and that's what set the whole pace for my time at this prison. You're just constantly walking around in fear. You're walking around on eggshells, and you have to fight over the pettiest things. It's just like the rules of the prison. And like I always explain this part of my story just so people can get an understanding. But if I had my name called during mail call, before I can even read the letter, I had to fight someone because somebody's jealous that I got a letter they didn't. If I called my family and I was on the phone and someone walked by and see me on the phone and got jealous that I actually had family that would talk to me, I'd have to get off the phone and fight. If I got visitation, I had to fight as soon as I got back. If I had canteen, I had to fight as soon as I got back to the dorm to keep my stuff. And I got all four of those things on a regular basis. So
Mm.
I was constantly fighting. And I remember like sitting on my bed one day and doing some like self examination. And I was like, listen, selling drugs got you here, doing drugs got you here. You're definitely a drug addict. You need to stay away. And like the only thing I knew about recovery was people, places, and things, and the words triggers. Um, and so that's what I was like. You need to stay away from the people, places, and things, and you have to stay away from things that trigger you. And I turned 21 while I was in this prison. So I was like, I'm just going to drink. I'm going to do what normal 21-year-olds do, and I'm going to get out and drink. And the day came for me to get out, and I had 3 years of probation. So I had to go check in with the probation officer. And as soon as I sat down with her and I looked at her, she goes, "How did you like Brevard?" Which that's the name of the prison, Brevard CI. And I was like, "Ma'am, like I hated every minute of it." And she's like, "Well, good, because in the state of Florida, there's zero tolerance. If you violate, you're going to go back to Brevard because you're still under the age of 24." And I knew she was being serious because I had seen people come back for a violation of probation. And in my head, in that moment, like I did not want to go back. Right? I just escaped that place. My last week there, I ended up getting into a fight over a card game, and I got my jaw dislocated, and I couldn't tell anybody that my jaw was dislocated, or I wouldn't go home. Right? Like I couldn't even. I had to eat like ramen noodle soup, the ramen noodle soup packs. I would put the packs in water like it's chicken broth. So like that's just like I didn't want to go back to that. And so in that moment, I looked at her and I said, "Ma'am, like you're not going to have any problems out of me. I'm going to do everything I need to do to complete probation off early. Like I already have a job lined up. I'm going to pay everything off. I'm going to do all the classes and pay the fines, and like you don't have anything to worry about. Like I promise. Like I'm going to be a good person." And in that moment, like I meant that. I could pass a lie detector test. I meant that with every ounce of my being. But what I didn't understand is how the disease of addiction attacks. And so I'm back at my house. It's probably like an hour or two after I left probation. And one of my friends shows up, and he's one of the friends that could just walk in the house, So I'm on my parents' back patio and I'm smoking a cigarette. And he walks straight out. He comes in. I don't hear him open and shut the door. But as he comes out on the back patio, he looks at me and there's no words exchange. He just hits his pocket and I hear these pills jangling. And it's like I go on autopilot. I go on autopilot and I stand up. We walk into my room. He hands me the pill. I crush the pill up and I snort it. And then after like all of that, right? Like the time it took me to stand up, go in the room with him, shut the door, get the pill, crush it up, snort it, nothing stopped me, right? Like I was on complete like autopilot. Um, and the Alcoholics Anonymous calls it the mental blank spot, and this is why like I relate to the 12 steps so much. Um, but then after I did it, I'm like, why did I just do that? Why did I just risk, affecting my zero tolerance on probation and going back to Brevard? And then the effects of the pill are hitting me, so the high's coming, and now it's like, you know what? You just did 16 months of misery. You deserve this. This is your one get out of jail free card. Just enjoy this feeling and don't do it again. Um, but my disease of addiction doesn't work like that. You know, Narcotics Anonymous has a saying that I love so much, and they say one is too many, a thousand's never enough, and that's exactly what happened. You know, working in the treatment industry, if someone's not in a 12-step program, I kind of like to correlate with the neuroscience of addiction. And it's like once those dopamine receptors are open and they get a taste of it, now it's they're craving more dopamine, right? And the Alcoholics Anonymous book talks about like we have an allergy of the body, right? And this was written in the 1930s. But Dr. Silkworth said that we have like an allergy of the body, and once we put any alcohol or drug into our body, it triggers this allergy. And what allergy means is I have an abnormal reaction, right? There's someone that could go have dinner tonight and have like one glass of wine and one beer and be fine for like a year, right? But there's something different. If I were to leave here after doing this Zoom talk and go to the bar and have one, I might not be off to the races that day, but I just opened up those dopamine receptors or this allergy or however you want to put it, right? I woke the beast up. And then I'm going to be like, see, I got away with one drink. I can do it again. But before I know it, it's going to grab a hold of me like it always does, what my experience in life shows, and I'll be back off to the races. And that's exactly what happened. I gave into that pill that day, and I had no plan on using it again, especially with them drug testing me on probation. But I'm using the next day, I'm using the next day, I'm using the next day. And then I'm in my head, I'm like, how do I get away with beating the drug test? So my brilliant thinking was I'll use for 27 days. I'll stop, go cold turkey from opiates for 3 days. I'll drink a bunch of water. I'll go to probation and I'll pass this drug test. And it worked for a little bit. And then, one day, after suffering 3 days of cold turkey, opiate withdrawal, I was like, I'm bringing these pills with me to the probation office and I deserve to have one the moment I get out. I'm going to do it in the parking lot. I don't care if she catches me after this drug test. I'm doing it right then and there. And once again, I didn't understand how my disease attacks me. But it's a 20-minute car ride from my parents' house to the probation office in Fort Pierce. But 10 minutes into the car ride, I find myself going on autopilot once again. I pull into a gas station, I get out, I walk in, I ask the clerk where the bathroom is. I go into the bathroom, I take the pill out, I crush the pill up, and then I snort it. Then I say, what the heck did I just do? I have a drug test in 10 minutes. Why would I risk using 10 minutes before a drug test? And then I was like, I'm just going to go and hopefully it's not in my system yet. Um, Once again, right, that mental blank spot, that autopilot, how my disease attacks. Um, I've worked in the treatment industry for a while. When I first got my foot in the door, I started as a IOP, nighttime IOP group facilitator. Then I took on full time group facilitator. Then I was still group facilitator, but I was also a nighttime IOP therapist. And there would be clients that would relapse and they would tell me the story and they're like, I don't know what happened. Like I'm at work and I get off of work and I go in to get, a soda and a bag of chips before IOP. And next thing I know, I have a beer to my mouth. And I would talk to them about my experience with that mental blank spot, and I would explain, and I would say this is why working a recovery program is so vital. Is we need something. So imagine having like an enemy, right? Or like being in your house and somebody breaks in your house and you have no idea they broke in your house, but before they know it, like you're in your room and you're like watching like Netflix or Hulu and you're like in your comfort zone, right? And then out of nowhere somebody's in your room with a mask on ready to attack you. You have no defense, there's nothing you could do, right? It's too late. And it's like, how do you, if we have a disease that attacks the same way, we need a recovery program that's efficient enough to I don't want to say prepare us for those attacks, right? But just completely like safeguard us that those attacks never happen. And I didn't know any of that back then. So the day that I go on autopilot and I go into the gas station and I drive to the probation office and I had a female probation officer, so she sends a male back there with me. And he does the drug test and then he looks at the cup and he's like, you failed for opiates. He's like, have you went to the hospital recently? And I'm like, no, sir, because I know in my head I need some kind of documentation to prove. And then he's like, how about the dentist? Have you went to the dentist lately? And I'm like, no, sir. And he's like, did you get prescribed any opiates? And I'm like, sir, like, I don't like I'm in my head and I'm like, how do I manipulate my way out of this? And I'm like, sir, like, I don't know what an opiate is. I'm like, what's an opiate? And then so he starts like giving me examples of what they are. And I'm like, sir, I'm like, if you look at my jacket, I'm here for selling cocaine and weed. I said, I don't even like cocaine. I said, I just sold cocaine to be cool, which I didn't know at the time. I thought I was lying, which, at that time, which I learned later in recovery, which was feeding my ego, which was the same thing. Um, but I was like, sir, like I'm a pothead. If anything, I'd fail for weed. I don't know what an opiate is. I was like, and like my mind's thinking of like how I can get myself out of this. And I was like, sir, I just drank a Monster Energy drink right before I came in. I was like, a matter of fact, I had two. That's my morning ritual. I'm like, would that alter my test? And back in 2005, they didn't know. So he's looking at the cup, he's looking at me, and I'm playing the innocent, role. And he throws the cup in the garbage. And he's like, next time, don't drink an energy drink before you come in. I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt. But if you fail next time, you're going back to prison. And so I left defeated, and I started questioning myself. And more fear comes in, right? More shame, more guilt. And like, I'm just piling it all on top of the game and guilt and fear and insecurity I've already accumulated. And it's just more. And I'm like, why couldn't I have waited 10 minutes? Like, what is it? Am I that bad of an addict, that I couldn't wait 10 minutes? And there was this conflict between me being a drug addict and me still having a choice and thinking it was a party. And so my brilliant thinking was, I'll use for 28, 29 days. I'll wake up at 3 in the morning. I'm going to chug water. By the time I go there, water is going to go into the cup and I'll pass. And needless to say, I failed the very next time. And for time's sake, I'm just going to go through this whole process quickly. I violated a couple times. Instead of the zero tolerance and sending me back, the judge would reinstate my probation. You know, the third time I violated, I played the addict role. I didn't want recovery, but I wanted to get out of trouble. So I asked them to send me somewhere. I didn't have insurance. So I went to a Christian program. While I was there, I found out I had another kid on the way with another girl. We ended up, talking and reconciling things for the sake of trying to have a family. And she gave me an ultimatum. She's like, "Hey, listen, if you use, like, it's over, but if you want to be a part, like, I'm going to give you a chance to be in this kid's life, and I want to be with you. But that's your ultimatum. If you use, it's like cheating on me, and I'll never forgive you." And I did good for 5 months. I had a job. They were like letting me work. We used to go to church services. We used to go to AA. They wanted me to get a sponsor, and I always tell this part of my story where I walked up to a stranger. I asked him to sponsor me, and the guy, he's like, "You're never going to call me. I could already tell you're never going to call me." And I'm like, "Sir, I promise I'm going to call you every day." No, I just needed his name and that number to show the pastor of this program, to show him that I was doing the work. And in my head, I didn't want to fully engage in recovery because I still struggled with whether I had the choice to stop on my own. And so needless to say, I did good for 5 months. I got engaged with that woman and planned on having this family, and life was going really good. Even though I wasn't fully working a recovery program, I was, half in and half out. Life was good. I had a good job. I was saving money up. I'm back with this girl. I'm seeing my other son. I'm seeing my new son, and I'm engaged, and we're planning on getting an apartment when I get out, and just everything was good. And I'm at work one day and I'm thinking about how great life is. And then this thought comes, what will make this better? Just one, just one, right? That lie, that's the subtle lie that our disease tells us, is just one. And I give in and I do one and I get away with it. And it wakes up that beast once again. And the next week I give in and I do it again. Then I'm doing it the next day, then the next day. And it's just it's the same pattern. And needless to say, I end up graduating that 6 month Christian rehab. I stood up for my graduation. I stood up in front of a whole church, and I'm sitting there and I'm praising how great recovery is and how to be sober. And meanwhile, I'm high. I'm lying to everybody. I have my fiance and my newborn baby next to me, and I'm just lying. And you know, I made it for a little bit, and then one day my son's mother, she asked me where all the money in the bank account's going. And this was still when the pill mills were around here, so things were cheap and there was plenty of them around, but my tolerance was really high because of that. And I was spending a lot of money. Anyways, I go to my cousin's house one day and I'm complaining to my cousin. I'm like, man, she's going to find out that I'm using behind her back. And she's asking me where this money's going. And I'm sitting there and I'm complaining. And this girl that was at my cousin's house, she's like, well, listen, she goes, instead of snorting 50 pills in one day, you could switch to become an IV drug user and you could use one pill a day and you could save money that way and she'll never find out. And my cousin immediately threw a fit. He was not an IV drug person at all. And he's like, no. He's like, I've watched too many of my friends go down that road, and my cousin's not doing that. And he like threatened me, like threatened to beat me up, and tell my parents. And I'm like, yeah, no, I can't do that. Now, needless to say, I remember being like, I don't know, 7, 8 years old, and I had to get like a flu shot or something when we first moved here for school. I remember dragging 7, 8 years old, dragging my mom, a doctor, and two nurses down the hallway, like they're pulling my arm. I hated needles, right? The only justification for me to become an IV drug user was somebody telling me you could continue to hide and lie and manipulate and get your way and continue to use. And so the moment my cousin got on the phone with someone, I looked at her. I'm like, give me a needle right now. And she's like, do you know how to do it? I'm like, no. And she's like, okay, I'm going to give you the needle. She's like, go in the bathroom, try. If you can't, I'll meet you down the road and I'll do it in my car. And I tried on my own. I couldn't do it. I was very skirmish of needles. And needless to say, I meet her. She shows me how to do it. And my disease hits a whole new progression, right? Um, she was right. The first time you have the effects of the IV drug use, you can in a sense use less. But what she didn't tell me is how fast the progression takes off from then on. And so, needless to say, things get bad. My boss, me and my boss get into it. He owed me some money. He was taking advantage of me because he seen how bad I was getting. He knew what I was doing. He knew I was hiding my use behind my fiance's back. So he tried to use that to his advantage and get over on me with some money. We got into it. And needless to say, he called my probation officer and reported me.
Mm.
So I walk into the probation office one day. And as I walk in the back to go drug test, it was my female probation officer and a male. And they both grabbed me by the shoulders. And it's summertime, right? I have long sleeve shirt on, I have jeans on, and I'm hiding everything. And they both grab my arms, they grab my shoulders, and my female probation officer pulls up my sleeve, and I have track marks and abscesses and bruises. And she looks at me and she goes, "Don't worry." She goes, "Your boss called here. Your boss told us how bad you are. We could see your visual track marks and your abscesses." She goes, "Don't worry, we're going to get you the help you need." She goes, "I don't know how you violated probation 3 times and had the judge reinstate your probation every time. And the very last time you had him send you to rehab," she goes, "I was against it every single time, especially with the zero tolerance policy." She goes, "Don't worry, we're going to get you the help we can. We're going to send you back to prison." And I ran. I ran out of there. I got away from them. I knew that they were going to put a warrant out for me. And I did the walk of shame and I told my son's mother what I had been doing. And I was waiting for her to leave me and go back to Miami with her family. And instead, she said to me, she said, listen, why don't you come with me to Miami? We'll go on the run for a little bit. You work, you save up some money, You leave us with some money and I'll stay and I'll wait for you after you get out of prison. And that's what I did. I ran to Miami. I worked. I saved some money. Um, was using behind her back. I didn't find it at first, but eventually, because of the cravings, right? When you take the drugs and alcohol away from me with no recovery in me, just complete white knuckle abstinence, I don't get better. I get worse, right? And then because I grew up in an era where I felt alone and I felt, attacked as a kid and I felt like no one cared. I learned to not be vulnerable and I never talked about everything. I was really good with putting a mask on. And on the exterior, I'm okay, but internally, I'm not. And, so they thought I was doing well, but internally, I was not. I had cravings, daily. And they didn't mind if I drank, and I would drink alcoholically at certain times when the family would. Um, like usually on the weekends they'd have parties, but I wouldn't drink throughout the weekday out of respect for them. But I ended up giving in and finding dealers down there. I'm using behind everybody's back. Um, and then one day the U.S. Marshals come and get me and they transfer me back up to St. Lucie County. And so that time I ended up getting sentenced to 27 months in prison and no probation. And while I was in prison on Valentine's Day of all days, I call home to talk to the fiance, and I could tell something's up, and there's another man with her, and I already know what's going on. I could hear him in the back saying, tell him," and she won't even talk. And I was like, "You're leaving me, right?" And she's like, "Yeah." I'm like, "You're leaving me for another guy, right?" She's like, "Yep." And I hang up the phone with her, and I go back to my bed, and once again, I'm doing self-examination, right? And I'm like, selling drugs cost me cost my freedom on two occasions. I'm in prison twice. It doesn't look good for my resume. I've lost these two women that I love and plan to marry that I have kids with. You know, um, I've hurt my family. I've wrecked employment opportunities, and I'm like, you're better than this. Like, so once again, the only thing I knew about recovery was people, places, and things and triggers. And I didn't think I was an alcoholic. I just thought I was a drug addict. So the day comes for me to get out, and all I wanted to do was go to one of my favorite restaurants. I wanted two Budweisers and a cheeseburger. That's it. And then I was going to go home, stay away from everybody, stay out of trouble, and start working on Monday. And I go out with some friends, and I didn't know one of them was doing pills. But we're sitting there, we're eating, we're talking, and this girl looks at me and she's like, "Hey, I can get these pills." And it was first thought right. Like you always hear first thought wrong in recovery. It was first thought right. In the forefront of my brain, I could think about the 16 months. I could think about the 27 months. I could think about the failed relationships. I could think about all of the wreckage. So I was like, no, I'm good. Like I'm not. I'm satisfied with these two Bud Lights and going home. But what I didn't know is my addiction doesn't work like that. Now the hamster wheel's going, right? The dopamine's craving that dopamine. And I look at her and I ask her how much. She tells me how much. I give her the money and I tell her to make a phone call. So here it is, first day out of prison, I'm back to using. Second day, I wasn't planning on using, I'm back to using, and then it progresses. And during this time, the DEA comes in, they put the database in for these pain mills, and they're cracking down on these pain mills. And I go from being able to go to the doctor and getting these pills and having large amounts around me because everybody's getting them to not being able to get them. My doctor got locked. My doctor got arrested and shut down. I went to another doctor. He got arrested and shut down. And then that was it for me. I couldn't find anybody. And, so from having such a high tolerance and then being limited, things got very bad. This is where I start breaking my morals. I've stolen from my mom's purse. My mom's caught me. I'll never forget that look in her face. I've stolen from people. I've borrowed my son's Christmas money thinking he wouldn't notice and I'd be able to pay it back by the time I got my paycheck, and he would never find out. Um, I've done a lot of things. Pawned some of my parents' belongings, but things got very dark and very quick. And then when you already have all this unresolved guilt, shame, fear, insecurity, and you're just continuing to pile more, and you're breaking morals, it's a very dangerous place to be. Because the self hate that I had for myself, the only thing I could do was drown it out with drugs and alcohol, and it was just a continuous cycle. And so I was with this girl, and she didn't use like I did, but she ended up getting like, you know, to the levels I was using just because she was with me. And her family stepped in one day and they told her, they're like, listen, we want you to go to rehab. If you don't go to rehab, we're taking your kids away. And I looked at her and I said, listen, you have insurance. I don't. You know, you're not as bad as I am. I am. I was like, for my exact words, for whatever reason, God condemned me to be a junkie. And there is no getting sober for me. This is just who I am. I said, I'm condemned to die on these streets a junkie. So I said, why don't you go to rehab and get your kids back? And I'm just going to go on to the bitter end, and I'm going to die on these streets a junkie. And I really did. I thought there was no hope for me. But needless to say, she goes to rehab. I go on one last hurrah because I was going to try to get sober on my own. And that night that she goes to rehab and I'm going out for one last time, I end up getting locked up. I'm in the county jail, and she's writing me these letters and she's telling me how great like treatment is, how great recovery is. And I remember I felt two things. One, I felt jealousy. Why could other people get sober and be happy and I can't? For whatever reason, I'm just condemned to never get sober. And it all went back to my childhood, right? All those core memories from the trauma. And two was there was a little bit of hope. There was a little bit of hope that it was possible for me. So my dad bonded me out for Thanksgiving. And instead of going to get drunk or high, I went to a meeting with her. And I got a sponsor, I got a home group, I got a service commitment home group. I was doing 90 meetings in 90 days. But the one thing I wasn't doing is I wasn't getting honest. I wasn't getting vulnerable. I wasn't telling everybody I had that mask on that I'm good, but inside I was dying. And I wasn't telling anybody that. So I lasted 60 days and I relapsed. And shortly after I relapsed, the girlfriend relapses too. And we end up homeless. I've never been homeless, but we end up homeless. And we ended up getting charged a burglary for something that really, in my eyes, wasn't a burglary, but whatever. It is what it is. I accept accountability now. Um, but we end up getting charged for. Well, she went for a misdemeanor. I go for the burglary. And while we're in the county jail, we're both in bond hearing together. And this guy walks in who's from classification, and he says, "Does anybody want to sign up for the drug program?" So I see her hand shoot up, and I know the St. Lucie County Jail like the back of my hand, unfortunately. And I know that the girls' drug dorm is right across from the guys' drug dorm in Delta East and Delta West. I know that on certain days they go to church, and on certain days they go to yoga. And so on certain days I'll get to see her, and it's easy for me to pass notes over through the trustees. And
Uh-oh. We lost him. Hold that for a moment.
So, when this gentleman comes in and he asks if anybody wants to sign up for the drug program, and her hand shoots up, my hand shoots up too. And I did like recovery from being involved in recovery before, but the whole reason my intention for going to that dorm for that program was out of codependency to be right by her. Um, so needless to say, she's there for a misdemeanor, so she only does 30 days and she goes home, but she was in the program for a little bit. And then I'm in the program. And because I'm really good about putting the mask on and I'm dying inside, my ego comes out, right? And I'm in this program and I'm faking it. And I remember the counselors like calling me on it and telling me to be like more sincere and genuine. I didn't know how to. I was scared to. I was scared to show anybody the real me because my core message was I'm a piece of crap. You know, there's something wrong with me and I'm a piece of crap. Even though I knew there was good inside me, it was drowned out by all of that negative self-talk, that hamster wheel. And so the lawyer, she comes to see me one day, and the lawyer sits down and she has an email. She printed out an email from the prosecutor, and she says, "Listen," she said, "the state attorney told me to come see you, and he told me to tell you this personally that he's sick of seeing your name come across his desk. And in the state of Florida, we have what's called a habitual felony offender enhancement. It's like three strikes and you're out. And they could use one drug possession, and the rest of them have to be separate offenses from drug possession." So she's like, "You qualify for the habitual felony offender enhancement with this burglary." And then I'm trying to justify, "Ma'am, it's not a burglary. It's, it was a drug deal gone bad. I had permission to be there." And I never took accountability. I just continued to play the victim and blame people, but so I'm sitting there and I'm like, "Ma'am, listen, I'm not taking 30 years. I'll take 5 years right now and we could get this done. I'll be off the state attorney's desk." And she gets mad and she's like, "You're not getting it. Like, by law, under the habitual felony offender enhancement, you have to get 30 years day for day." So because it was a burglary that carried a 15-year mandatory charge, when they enhance it, it gets doubled. And then there is no good behavior. They take that away for you. It's like a punishment. And she immediately, after she yells at me and tells me that's it, that's the deal, that's what I'm getting, she gets out of there. She has the officer get her out of there before I could freak out, which I wouldn't have did anything to her. But I just remember like the room had shrunk in and I felt like I was suffocating. And what went through my head was my addiction took me too far this time, right? Like I had many warnings. Everybody warned me throughout the years, and I thought it was a game, right? I thought I could stop when I want. I thought I still had the choice, and the writing was on the wall the whole time that I was an addict. And so I remember like I'm like my addiction took me too far this time, and there's no coming back, you know. So I went back to the dorm, and by then the girlfriend she had been out and she was back in sober living and IOP, and she was going to meetings and had her sponsor. So I wanted to call her because I knew once I told her that I was getting 30 years, she was going to leave. But so I call her and she says, "Hey, listen, me and you need to have a talk." So I'm like, my lawyer must have called her. So needless to say, she's like, "Hey, I'm gonna go first," and she's like, "My sponsor said that we're toxic, and I'm leaving you." And I'm like, "Good, because I'm getting 30 years." And I slammed the phone down. And then the second phone call was to my parents. So my dad was like my biggest enabler. He was always there to try to get me out of jail or whatever I needed, right? And my mom wasn't talking to me. As a matter of fact, my mom didn't talk to me for my first 3 years of sobriety. That's how bad I hurt this woman. And so I called to talk to my dad to tell my dad what happened. And my mom answers and she's actually talking to me for a second. And then she's like, "Hey, listen," she goes, "Your lawyer called here. Your lawyer was on the phone with your dad. I don't know what your lawyer said to your dad, but your dad had a heart attack while he was on the phone with your lawyer. Your dad's in the ambulance on his way to the hospital." She goes, "You probably killed your father. Don't ever call back here again." She hangs up. And so I was expecting the girlfriend to leave me with the news, but the news of my father devastated me. And then I only had one other person that would put money on the phone for me to call, and that was my youngest son's mother. And when I call her, she says, "Hey, listen, I just talked to your other son's mother. Both of your kids are acting out at home. They're acting out at school. You did this to them." She goes, "Don't call back here till you get your life together." And she hangs up. And once again, I had that feeling where the room shrunk in on me and I was suffocating. And I was like, not only did my addiction take me too far this time, and I'm facing 30 years mandatory, but everybody's completely given up on me. And the news possibly killed my father. Like I did this to my father. And so the only way I could see out of this situation is, like I said, I didn't think recovery was possible for me. So the only way I could see out of the situation was to kill myself. And I went up to my dorm and in St. Lucie County Jail between 6 o'clock to 8 o'clock at night. They locked the doors and it's count time. And what everybody would do in the drug program is they would go to sleep around 5:30. Everybody would shut their doors early. They would go to sleep at 5:30. The officers would let us sleep because we had a volunteer that would come in at 8 o'clock at night to bring an Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in. And so my idea was I'm going to wait. There's 6 doors. I'm going to wait for 5 doors to shut. Once I hear 5 doors shut at 5:30, I'm going to wait. And when my roommates are sleeping, I had a sheet tied around my neck and I had my blanket over me so they couldn't see me. I was going to run outside, slam my door so they couldn't get to me. And with all 6 doors being locked, no inmate would get to me in time. I was going to tie my sheet over the balcony and I was going to jump. And by the time an officer or inmate got to me, it would be too late. And I heard 4 doors shut, and I'm waiting for this fifth door to shut so I could go do this. And I'm getting mad. I'm getting mad because I want this door to shut already, and I want to go do this, and I want to get it over with. And I was completely ready to go do it. And as I'm sitting there, like I'm so mad, like I'm on the verge of tears. I just want to get it over with. And all of a sudden, I just felt this peace come over me, and this calm. It was my own voice, but this calm voice said, "Hey, listen. Um, you don't know for sure if your dad died, and if you kill yourself and your dad didn't die from the heart attack, he might actually have a heart attack and die." And then another voice, same voice, but like another statement. Um, hey, listen, don't be selfish. If your father really did die and then you kill yourself, your family's going to be planning 2 funerals instead of one. So don't kill yourself. And those 2 statements hit me really hard. And I was able to like kind of compromise with myself. Then I was like, well, listen, if you get to 30 years, don't be selfish. Do this for your kids. At least your kids could come visit you and write you and have some kind of relationship with you. You could be some kind of father. It might not be the life you wanted, but at least you could be there for them. And that was enough for me to talk myself out. And then I was like, you know what? I might not get these 30 years. It's not set in stone yet. And then as I untie the sheet around my neck, I heard door 5 shut. And I got up, I stood up, and I shut my door, which was the last door, door 6. And once I shut that door, I'm safe, you know? And I went to my bed and I cried and I passed out. So the doors pop at 8 o'clock. And I think one of the strongest things, I think one of the bravest things, I think the first step in recovery is honesty and vulnerability. And so when the volunteer came at 8 o'clock to bring the Alcoholics Anonymous meeting in, it was the first time I ever got honest and vulnerable, and I broke down. Um, I wouldn't cry in front of men back then. I had still had the ego, right? But like I'm on the verge of tears, I'm fighting it back. But I let everybody know I was not good, and I hadn't been good in a while. And I told him I just tried to kill myself. And so when the meeting was over, the volunteer he came up to me and he said, "Hey, what do you think about working the 12 steps?" And I didn't think it was possible. I didn't trust my sponsor in the very beginning. He wouldn't be the person I would pick. He just happened to be there at the right time, and thank God for that, you know. And so he got permission from the chaplain to meet me every Wednesday through the in the jail, and we met for an hour to go through the 12 steps. And I would see him when he brung the meeting in at nighttime. So between that, we got all the step work done. And there's a part in the 12 steps where you do your fourth and fifth step, and it's like, to me, it's like trauma. It's like doing a trauma timeline in a sense. That's how I could correlate it with clinical recovery. And this is where I got down to like my deep dark secrets, everything that was holding that guilt and shame over me, all that fear and security was all in there. And so when it came time to do my fifth step, which was confess everything, I was scared to do it with my sponsor. I was scared to tell him everything because I didn't want him to look at me, because my core message for 18 years, and we can even go before the addiction when the trauma happened, my core message is there's something wrong with me. I'm a bad person, I'm a piece of crap, and I'm unworthy of being loved, and I didn't want my sponsor to hear all of my deep, dark secrets and then confirm my core message. Because if he looked at me and told me I was a bad person or I was a piece of crap, then it was true. And that's what I was scared of. So, needless to say, we do my fifth step and I confess everything. And my sponsor, he looks at me and he says, "Is that it?" And I say, "Yes." He means, like, "Is that everything? Am I leaving anything out?" And I'm like, "No, like, that's everything." And he goes, "Are you sure?" And I say, "Yes." And he looks at me and he goes, "The good news is I forgive you, and so does God." And I literally had a white light spiritual awakening right then and there. Everything was gone. I felt different. I got back to the dorm. Immediately, the first person who seen me said something looked different about me. He seen the change in me. And that was the moment that I knew recovery was real. I knew the power of recovery, and I was on fire ever since, still to this day. Ever since then, I've been on fire for recovery. And I went through the remainder of the 12 steps. And as we got to step 12, we shut the book of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I look at my sponsor and I'm like, "What next?" And he laughs at me. He's like, "What do you mean, what next?" He's like, "Now it's time to sponsor other addicts and alcoholics." And I'm like, "Bro, like, I'm an inmate about to do 30 years. Like, no one's gonna want me as their sponsor." And my sponsor said, "Don't worry." He said, "Me and Chaplain Dave are gonna meet every Wednesday and we're gonna pray for God to put people in your life you can help." That was a little over 10 and a half years ago. They've met every week for over 10 and a half years and continue to say that prayer for God to put people in my life I can help. And you know me personally, so you know that prayers came true. And I know they missed one week because Chaplain Dave had COVID, and I think they missed another week because my sponsor was in the Keys. But besides that, every week, right? And so, needless to say, the time comes for me to go in front of the judge. I go in front of the judge. The state attorney walks over, hands the judge a paper. The judge reads it, 30 years. The state's asking for 30 years, day for day, habitual felony offender. And the judge, he asked me if I have anything to say. And so it was the first time I ever took accountability. That's what recovery told me, to take accountability. I said, "Listen, Your Honor," I said, these charges, I don't fully agree with it being a burglary charge, but that's neither here nor there. The way the law reads, it's a burglary." And I said, "I'm here to take accountability whether I agree with it or not. It's the law." And recovery, recovery has told me to take accountability. And I said, "Your Honor, I also want you to know part of the circumstances is I was under the influence of drugs and I was homeless. And I'm not here to make excuses for why I did what I did. I'm here to take accountability. But I'm also here to tell you, for the first time ever, I've been involved in this drug program. They kept me on an additional four. I stayed an additional 4 months to mentor other men. I went the extra mile. I got a sponsor. I worked the 12 steps. I said, for the first time in my life, I see recovery is possible. I've changed. I'm continuing to change. I said, all I'm asking for, I'm not here to tell you to do what to do with your job and like how much time to give me. All I'm asking for is that you please do not give me the 30 years and you give me a chance to be on the streets again. So now that I've finally found recovery, I can actually live recovery on the street and I can help people out there with my experience." And so the judge takes a recess and he comes back and he looks at me and he goes, "I don't know why I'm doing this, but the judge says, I'm giving you a total of 6 years in the Department of Correction, followed by 4 years of probation, which is a total of 10 years habitual felony offender." And what I learned is the judge gave me an illegal sentence. So in the state of Florida, whenever someone gets a habitual felony offender sentence, it has to be 10 years mandatory, which is 10 years day for day or more. But the way the judge worded it, it never got caught. So when he gave me 6 years in prison with 4 years of probation, and he said a total of 10 years habitual felony offender, nobody ever caught what he did, not even the state attorney. And to me, that's a God thing, or the universe, whatever is greater than us, that's out there, that's in control. It worked in my favor that day. So needless to say, I know we're getting kind of late on the hour, but um, oh, we went over an hour. Sorry.
That's okay.
So needless to say,
Your story is important. You know, somebody needs to hear it.
thank you. Um, so as soon as I got to prison, I started helping right away. There's drugs and alcohol in prison. The officers don't care. They don't get paid enough to care. Um, it's crazy, but I got involved with Alcoholics Anonymous in prison right away. I started sponsoring men in there right away. Um, I started chairing the Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I started writing the Alcoholics Anonymous Grapevine magazine. I have 5 articles published in Alcoholics Anonymous Grapevine magazine. One of those articles is published in the Alcoholics Anonymous Grapevine Prison Edition book. I started working with an IOP program. They helped me behind the prison's back to get certified so I could work at treatment when I got out. After 16 months of teaching this IOP program and doing some extra work for this organization, I got certified. I have my CAC, my Certified Addictions certification. The day came for me to get out of prison, and instead of going back to drugs and alcohol like my pattern had been on the first day, I jumped right in. I went to Alcoholics Anonymous meetings. I got my first job in treatment, working as an IOP nighttime IOP group facilitator. It's a position that nobody wanted. I took. I was happy to take, and I worked my way up. And I got very involved in the recovery community. At that time, I was an IOP therapist, and I come home from work one day, and my dad tells me that he has stage 4 lung cancer, and he's doing chemo. He said, if the chemo doesn't work, that's it. Like, I'm gonna eventually die. Looking back now, because my dad was a very man's man and he wasn't vulnerable, that was my dad's way of saying, brace yourself for this family because you're going to be the man of the family now. And the recovery community was there for me. My sponsor would have me go to meetings and raise my hand. And I'd say, I'm Gio and I'm alcoholic, and my dad's dying of stage 4 lung cancer. And when he dies, I don't know how I'm going to handle it. So I'm going to need you guys to be there for me. I had to go to every meeting and say that. And I did. I did what my sponsor said. And because I did that, when my dad did die, the community was there for me, like overwhelmingly there for me. And I made it through that, and I thought I healed. I thought I grieved. As a therapist, I thought I grieved, and I ended up getting in a relationship with a girl that I still love to this day, and I really loved her. And we get in a relationship, and it was like one of my first healthy relationships, which I didn't know how to handle either sometimes. um, but we end up getting engaged. Actually, let me back up before she even got engaged. Things were getting very serious, and we talked about marriage and we talked about kids. And there were still parts of me that would push her away because of my dad dying and grieving and some unresolved trauma I never worked through. There would be times where things were good and they'd be too good, and I'd be waiting for something to happen, and I'd do something to push and fight. And she's seen it. She's seen right through it. And she looked at me one day and she goes, listen, she goes, you never grieved your father's death. She goes, I can tell you can't even talk about it. She's like, you're a therapist. You know what to do. She goes, either you see a therapist or I'm leaving you. And so I did. I went to see a therapist. It started as grief and loss therapy, and then it turned into childhood trauma therapy. And I ended up doing the work, and I had like a second spiritual awakening, right? I remember driving to work one day and I wasn't miserable inside anymore. And all of a sudden, like the music was like electricity coming through the speakers. And I had the windows down. I'm going over the Roosevelt Bridge, and the sky is like perfect crystal blue, and the air is hitting me just right. And like I just finally felt like I was one with the world again. And it was from doing trauma therapy. And that's when I became a big advocate for trauma therapy. So during that time that I was doing trauma therapy, I was also doing an intense fear inventory, which is part of the 12 steps. And I started seeing like a correlation between the fear inventory and childhood trauma and where fears derives from and how it affects our core beliefs. And so I came up with my own formula to try to teach my clients that were in treatment because I figured I was so tired of seeing clients like leave and relapse. I was like, I got to do something like really hardcore with them. And so I started teaching this formula that I had went through myself in treatment. And one of my clients is like, you should write a book. Like, dude, I would do these groups and like they would break down crying, and they would open up and everybody be getting vulnerable and they would talk about like getting molested. And I'd always lead it with my story and like stuff I had been through, and they'd hear my strength, and it would open up this safe place in the door for them to do the same. And like I'm watching this healing take place. And so when the client told me I should write a book, and because I already had articles published in the Grapevine magazines and the book, I was like, let me write a book. So I wrote a very amateur book on childhood trauma. Like I said, it's very amateur. It's on Amazon. It's called Fear, Face Everything and Rise. And that opened up the door to what I'm doing now with clinical outreach. So I work for what I feel like is one of the best um, trauma informed mental health and substance abuse treatment centers in Florida. There's a couple other ones that I truly love as well. You work for one of them. We talk about that. Um, but I love trauma therapy. Like I absolutely love it. I love watching the healing take place where people come in completely broken and just all of a sudden the light comes back on their eyes. Like I'm addicted to watching that now.
Mhm.
And so with that being said, I now do clinical because of the platform my book gave me. I stepped out of doing therapy and I do clinical outreach now, which I love, but it's came back in full circle, right? So like all of those things I've held guilt and shame over in my life, not only do I speak about on public, a public forum all over, um, but the same court system that sent me to prison is the same court system calling me now to ask for recommendations of where to send clients when they have issues. I just got a call from the public defender's office about an adolescent who's acting out, and they sent them to a juvenile program, and it didn't help. And I'm hearing the story of this kid, and I'm like, has anybody sent him to a therapist? Like, you're explaining all trauma. He's acting out because he's hurting inside. And they're like, no, like I didn't think about that. But it's like so common sense to me. I guess maybe because it's my life, you know?
Theo,
And
can I just say I've literally probably had goosebumps for like the last 10 minutes of your story. And it's just, I'm so grateful that you're willing to be. Speaking of honest and vulnerable, I mean, I think, everybody is honest and vulnerable when they tell their story, but the level of honesty and vulnerability and even the therapeutic threads that you're tying through your story to show people what helped you and what really worked for you and the layers of healing and treatment and things that you needed to get to this place is just like it's mind blowing. You talk about a spiritual experience, and not everybody has a spiritual experience like that.
no.
I think it's absolutely beautiful that you had two, and that you get to continue to bring this message to people who are still struggling and you have such a beautiful story. And of course I'm going to tag all those links and your articles in your book and whatever else you want me to put in the description for when I put this on YouTube. um, but in and as a therapist, of course, I'm always like, I love it when some of the people that I see are not, they're real hesitant with 12-step recovery and different things like that. And
Mhm.
we've talked about that before.
Sure.
And so showing that, yes, that was a big part of your story, but showing that there are other big parts of your story and how important therapy and especially trauma therapy is,
Mhm.
because that's probably one of the top reasons from my perspective that people continue to relapse is that they don't recognize, they don't see that connection. And you having talked about this so much and being able to weave that back in from the beginning of your story, not just from the big T traumas that you experienced, but some of the other things that you
Mhm.
experienced and show how that's shown up throughout your life is such a gift to be able to share your story like that. And I definitely feel honored that I got to be a part of that, and anybody who gets to see this will definitely feel honored as well. And I'm sure there's a lot more that you can say, and certainly if there are big things that you missed, I would love to share that. But I just wanted to ask you a couple questions as we start to wind this down. And
Sure.
what are the? Oh, I don't know if you could hear that. It's storming like crazy out here
It
right
is here
now.
too.
I don't know if that shows up in the video. We may be able to edit that out or not, or maybe we'll leave it because maybe it's spirit talking to us. Who knows?
Yeah, right.
This incredible story that you have. There are a couple things that I wanted to ask. Is one, what was the point where, I mean, I know you had that spiritual awakening, so that may have something to do with it, but what was the point where it started to become more natural for you to be sober and to be in recovery, and where you didn't feel like, a lot of people say you were crawling out of your skin, so to speak, right? Was there a point, can you recognize that, and also like the biggest challenges in that early recovery piece?
So actually, yes. Prior to me having this spiritual awakening, and when I talk about the spiritual awakening, it's not vital for everybody. Like there's so many different reasons people use drugs and alcohol, and there's people with the disease of addiction, and there's people that are like just addicted. Alcohol and drugs do create a dependency. So it's really just basis off that. But with that being said, um, after my sponsor had asked me to work with him to do the 12 steps, the very next week the counselor came in and he started teaching us about the disease of addiction, and I finally started getting answers of why I couldn't stop, right?
Mm-hmm.
Why I stole from my mom's purse, and like that's a big no-no in an Italian family. You don't steal from your family. I mean, in any family it is, right? But like growing up in an Italian family, like there's things you get shamed for doing, and like that was one thing that
Sure.
I immediately felt a lot of shame, but why
We call that cognitive dissonance in therapy, right? Like
yes.
you know that it's wrong, you know that that's not who you are as a person, but you couldn't stop doing it at that time,
So
right?
exactly right. And when I finally started learning about the disease of addiction and why I couldn't stop and why I did things against my own will that I didn't want to do and why I broke my morals, it lessened the blow. Instead of blaming myself, I blamed the disease of addiction. But then I understood that I needed to work a program of recovery or I was going to continue that same pattern, whether I wanted to or not. I didn't have that choice, and that's when I learned how vital recovery is. Now, recovery is not one size fits all either. It's going to look different for everybody. I would have never did trauma therapy if I didn't do the 12 steps first, because that's how I learned through 12 steps how to become vulnerable, and then later on I was finally ready to face some of those things, and that's when I learned my sexual trauma was sexual trauma. I didn't know that until a therapist called me out on that, and then she rephrased it. If that was your client, how would you? And I'm like, oh, mind blown. You're right.
Right. Yeah, because for you it was normal, right? And like you said, your dad was like, "Hey, atta boy."
Yes,
Even though you had that same cognitive dissonance, that thinking like it didn't feel right, right? But
hmm
at the same time you were getting applauded for it, and so there was this, not only a thinking difference, but like in the physical body, right? You had that experience of feeling that like this doesn't feel right, right?
correct,
Yeah.
correct. And that's where some detachment comes. I learned how to disassociate with those feelings. You know,
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of people do that, right? Even when you stop drinking and using, you can continue those same behaviors if you don't learn how to regulate your nervous system, how to do things differently, and
Mhm.
how to heal, right? It's about, to me, in recovery and trauma recovery and all of those things is about integrating all parts of yourself
So
because they're all part of your story.
I 100% agree. To me, it's body, mind, and spirit, body, mind, and soul, whatever you want to say.
Yeah. So, what would be the top 3 to 5 things that you would want to impart? I mean, I'm sure your book has a lot of that, so we'll definitely link that here. But the top 3 to 5 things that you would want to impart on people who are still struggling. Any advice that you have just to kind of wrap this up full circle of what, if somebody still isn't sure.
Sure. So being in the recovery community for as long as I have, with my own experiences and then hearing others, for working in treatment for 6 years and being a therapist, um, we all struggle. Even people that, even normal people that don't um have issues with drugs and alcohol, the normal person struggles as well. You know, you're not alone, I would say. You're not unique. Like I said, everybody struggles. Everybody's done something wrong. Everybody has, guilt and shame, and they have that moral compass, and they've done things in their lives that they regret. Um, but we don't heal unless we get honest and vulnerable and shed the guilt and shame. The guilt and shame to me serves no purpose. To me, it operates on the same frequency as um, the flight or flight instinct that's ingrained in us, and it's constantly releasing signals of adrenaline and cortisol, which is tied with anxiety and depression and self pity, and like we can go down the list, right? And if I could get rid of the guilt and shame and set that um, chemical balance right in my body again, then it's easier to work through life. Little traumas. You mentioned it before. I am huge, huge, huge on little traumas. So like I said, recovery and addiction to me is not one size fits all. I am a firm believer trauma is tied with addiction and substance abuse and mental health. I've heard stories where people have had the perfect life and they're like, I don't have any trauma. The more you talk to them, there's a bunch of little traumas. And then I'll be like, well, how did it make you feel? Your mom and dad were hard on you to get A's and B's. How did it feel that one time you walked home and you got a C? Well, I felt insignificant. I felt like I didn't have my parents' love that day. That's a little trauma, right? And the more I sit down with those people that say they don't have any trauma, there's usually a theme. There's a core belief that's instilled in us when that first little T happens. And then, it could be, oh, well, the girlfriend broke up with me the next year. So I felt insignificant and unloved then. And then, all of a sudden, someone's a workaholic. They might not be a drug addict or alcoholic, but they're a workaholic and they're trying to always people please, but they don't understand where it's coming from. A lot of these things are rooted in childhood, and we've never stopped to challenge our core beliefs of something that happened when we were little kids that wasn't that big of a deal, but when we were little kids it was a huge deal.
Right. Yeah. And that shapes the way we view life. And that's
Yes,
really the thing is the more we can bring awareness to that, right? Like that's just like step one. We can't change anything until we recognize there's a problem. Right.
exactly.
So until we become aware of those beliefs and the way that we're carrying ourselves through the world and what's not working for us, we can't make any changes. So and it's layered processes. And I think one of the other things that I just want to point out with your story is something that I say all the time, and it's like consequences might be enough to get you sober, but they're not enough to keep you sober, right? And I think your
No,
story is such a good example of that. And it took a many layered process of people, speaking of people, places, and things, it took the right people, the right timing, and that internal desire to finally make a change, right? And to
i
continue that change.
I agree. I agree.
Yeah. Well, is there anything else that you really want to make sure that's said here before we wrap it up for today?
No, I think that's it. And I apologize. Like I said, sometimes I get into telling my story and I go over an hour. I know we had an hour time frame and we went way over. So
That's
I just want to thank you for this opportunity. I want to thank you for your time, especially the extra time that we went over.
okay.
And
You're worth the extra time, my friend.
thank you. Thank you. And thank you for all that you do in the community, not just with people struggling with addictions and mental health, but you also do a lot for the ones that help. You do a lot for the therapists and the ones that work in treatment. So thank you.
You're welcome, and thank you. I hope you guys really took the time to listen to this whole story and got something out of it, and I hope you share it. And if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to reach out, and we're here to support you. Thank you so much.